Okay. Um, it says that's down there. Anyways, Article 3. So we've got through most of the stuff. Right. We've got through the jurisdictions. We got through original appellates. We talked about um, original opinions of the court. I mean, they're not set in stone. The actual court itself. I do have a link. Ooh, let's see if the link works. No, it does not. That's fine. Um, all right. So we talked about all these guys and girls. Um, got through judicial restraint, judicial activism. Scalia, this is a more in-depth detail. We don't need to talk about it because I kind of mentioned it. Um, treason. We got through the treason. I mentioned the Robert or Richard Hansen, the movie's Breach, if you ever get a chance. And then we started getting into these people. And I believe we get to Ashley Hastings there in 1988.
Yeah.
Okay. Walter. Yeah. Walter Nixon. He was convicted and removed. Samuel Kent resigned. And then Thomas Porteous. Now, the ones that I brought up that I thought were the interesting ones, Harry Claiborne. So he was never impeached. He served 17 months in prison for tax evasion. And it wasn't even like 100% clear that he did. It was kind of it was just enough information that they said, yeah, you did. But while he was in jail, um, he never was, he wasn't fired from his position as a, so they put him in jail. Yes, he had tax evaded, but he was a Supreme Court justice still, or I'm sorry, a federal judge. So he was still getting a paycheck the entire 17 months that he was in prison. Then after he got out of prison, they impeached him, and that was when they were actually able to fire him from his position. So that the irony was that he was in jail for tax evasion and yet was still getting paid for us. And then Ashley Hastings, who on the last page, 1988, he was impeached, and then he served. So he was convicted. Part of it was the court that he was in. There was a little bit of an issue with that one, but he is still currently a representative for Florida, so he's able to run his position. And in favor, he was one of the people that was in favor of impeaching Trump, and that was pretty much along party lines. So the coincidence, not irony, coincidence was that he was impeached and fired, and then he was in favor of impeaching President Trump. A lot of these guys, the reason I put their names up here was because a lot of them, even though they were out, they were still practicing, like they were doing certain things. So they were barred from holding office, but they were still able to practice law. They were still legitimate lawyers. So it doesn't mean your life's over. Federal court circuits. I think you guys have a picture of that on there. So we have, let's see, we got 11. 11 federal court circuits. We have one in Ohio, or the 6th district. So if you ever hear, like right now, the big one you'll hear, this is what trending is. If when Trump was in office, the 9th Circuit, because California is in there, was the court that typically was the one that would say, no, what you're doing is illegal. Right now, the 5th Circuit is the one that has initially said something to President Biden about the OSHA rules regarding 100 employees or more having to get a vaccination. They have filed a law, or they have paused the executive order saying you can't enforce that. We've got to look at the legality of this first. And I believe another court did the same thing, another one of the courts. So you hear this all, that's very, very common. Anytime a president does something where they pass a law, sometimes the courts step in and go, oh, hold on a second, we got to look at that. All right. Now we kind of get into Supreme Court cases and how they've affected us. Some of them are not as exciting, some of them are a little more relevant to today. So this first one Nothing horribly exciting. Chisholm v. Georgia led to the passage of the 11th Amendment. This was the original jurisdiction. Like, who is it that has more power, the federal or the state? Right, so, who in the end gets to win out on this? I believe the courts adjusted the Constitution via the 11th, and I will play the summary for you. It's not that glamorous of a summary. Of course, I'll bring it over.
An Introduction to Constitutional Law, 100 Supreme Court Cases Everyone Should Know, by Randy Barnett and Josh Blackman. Number 1, Chisholm v. Georgia, 1793. Referring to the first 3 words of the Constitution, he explained that, quote, our national scene opens with the most magnificent object which the nation could present. The people of the United States are the first personages introduced. Finally, Wilson turns to the text of Article 3, Section 2. By ratifying this provision, Wilson says, the people of Georgia had consented to the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court when the state of Georgia was sued by a citizen of another state. Quote, as to the purposes of the Union, therefore, Georgia is not a sovereign state. We hope you enjoyed this.
Didn't really say much. The idea there was that Georgia kept on saying that you cannot, like this state can't sue this state, or this person cannot sue another state. And that was the issue. It is still being debated today via the suing the state. Chisholm was from Mississippi, and there was a waterway issue, and he sued a different state, not his state. And that was where the Supreme Court came back and said, you cannot sue another state. You can sue your state, but not another state, because there's all sorts of variations on that one. All right. Let's go to the next one. Come on. There we go. Good. This one is an important one, especially for precedent. This is a big. This one dealt a lot with the precedent of previous Supreme Court rulings. Right. So we have Dred Scott v. Sanford, and the idea was once free, always free. That was Dred Scott's claim. Was listen, I moved to the state, I was free, I lived in a free state, and then I moved back south, and now you're claiming I'm not free. That's not accurate. I was free, once free, always free. In the end, Dred Scott lost the case, but there's a nice little twist at the end of the story in general.
Hi, my name is Matthew Kinster. I'm a historian, and here are a few things you need to know to sound smart about the Dred Scott case. This is the story of a husband and a wife, 2 enslaved people who both filed for freedom in circuit court in St. Louis, Missouri in 1846 and set off an 11-year odyssey that culminated in 1857 in the most infamous decision of the U.S. Supreme Court. Dred Scott was held as a slave by a family that moved him first to Alabama and then to Missouri. And then he was sold to another man named John Emerson, who took him to Wisconsin Territory, present-day Minnesota, where he was held at Fort Snelling. There he met Harriet Robinson, who was the slave of an Indian agent. They married, they had 2 daughters, and then John Emerson owned both of them and their children, took them back to St. Louis. That's when, in 1846, Dred and Harriet Scott filed freedom suits in St. Louis Circuit Court. They knew that there was a doctrine in state courts called once free, always free. If you were an enslaved person held in free territory, like the Wisconsin Territory, then you should be freed even in a slave state like Missouri. That 11-year odyssey took them all the way up to the Supreme Court, the one that ruled against Dred Scott in 1857. The ruling had 3 main parts. First, it said that blacks did not have rights in federal courts as federal citizens. Second, it said that slave states no longer had to honor the once free, always free doctrine. And third, it said that Congress never should have prohibited slavery in the Wisconsin Territory in the first place, or in any territories. It was a dramatic blow in the sectional crisis. It created a huge firestorm of controversy and ultimately is one of the leading causes of the coming of the Civil War. Even though the Scots lost their case in court, they actually won their freedom. The children of Scots' original owners, some of them in St. Louis, had become anti-slavery. They had helped fund the Scots' legal case for many years, and now in 1857 they stepped up and bought the family and then freed them. Dred Scott lived another year, but he lived as a free man. His wife and their 2 daughters lived the rest of their lives as free people. There are still descendants of the Scott family in America today. Despite the tragedy of the case and its infamous nature, there was a human triumph within it.
Young people in large numbers came out and joined what became known as the Red.
Right. So again, this is one of those things where precedent kind of took over, and they said infamous on purpose. So it wasn't a famous case; it was infamous because it really kind of skewed the lines of what the passage of the Missouri Compromise, when we had the North and the South basically divided, and the Supreme Court came out on the side of the South and basically said you're not allowed to do that. Can't divide up the states. Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal. This one actually was a case regarding Plessy, and he was used as a patsy. They used him on purpose. He knew about it. He got involved in it. He was 1/8 black, and the idea was it shouldn't. Why are we having papers? Why do we have separation of people on the railroads? And in the end, they found in favor of Ferguson, not Plessy. And hopefully the video gives you a little blurb if I can get it to work here.
Hi, I'm Yahuwah Williams. I'm a historian, and here's what you need to know in order to sound smart about Plessy versus Ferguson. The Plessy versus Ferguson case originated with Louisiana's infamous Separate Car Act of 1890. The Separate Car Act required African Americans and whites to sit in segregated compartments on public carriers in Louisiana. People at the time of the Plessy decision actually believed that it was possible to measure the amount of black blood a person had in their body. The plaintiff in the Plessy case, Homer Adolph Plessy, was actually described as 7/8 white. Homer Plessy was arrested after he refused to give up his seat in defiance of the Separate Car Act of 1890. Plessy versus Ferguson is considered an important case because it established the doctrine of separate but equal that allowed states for the first time to legally segregate the races. One of the reasons that Homer Plessy brought suit was because of the difficulty in enforcing segregation in states like Louisiana. Louisiana had a large mixed race population, making it very difficult to determine where the line could be drawn in terms of separating the races. The doctrine of separate but equal that grew out of Plessy versus Ferguson became the standard for all segregation ordinances after that decision. Despite the Supreme Court's ruling in Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, the first municipality or city to pass a residential segregation ordinance was Baltimore, Maryland in 1910. The Supreme Court's landmark ruling in Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 ultimately was the death knell for the doctrine of separate but equal established in Plessy versus Ferguson. Young people in large numbers came out and joined.
So again, there's just a basic gist of that one. All right, Schneck v. U.S. This was an interesting one because freedom of speech is not included if you're talking about seditious speech. If there's a clear and present danger with what you're saying. So this is kind of where we thought that Oliver Wendell Holmes was one of the judges for this one. The quote from Oliver Wendell Holmes was, "Your rights end where my nose begins." Right. So if you and I are in a verbal fight and we're just talking to each other and yelling at each other, that's one thing. We can have that speech and we're angry. But the moment my fist hits your nose, I've now infringed on your right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Therefore, the freedom of speech has gone away. It's kind of like yelling bomb on a plane. Probably not so much, right? Or fire in a theater, because there's some things that will happen when you say these things that's not freedom of speech. You're causing a clear and present danger, right? In school, This happened a couple years ago. I had a kid that was talking about a friend of his who went to the career center and jokingly said, "Oh my gosh, this weekend he was talking about this list that he has of who he would take out first." And this weekend we were at a gun show and he was talking about getting more guns and I knew who they were talking about and I knew that it was a joke, but I stopped them and I said, "You guys realize I cannot not do something. I have to tell someone you guys said this." Right? Location, location, location. So I had the principals come up and I said, "Listen, I know that they're joking around, but you need to be aware that they're talking about this kid, and these are the three boys that were talking about it." And inevitably, they brought the kid into the office. They did a whole research in the background of it, and they found the guy was joking around. He had no suspicious activities. There was nothing that led them to think he actually would do anything. Regardless, clear and present danger, especially in a school setting, those are things you don't really joke around about. Same thing has happened a couple of times when people are joking around about going out and partying over the weekend. I had one kid a couple years back that said, "Oh, I got so wasted this weekend," and I was sitting. This is as close as we were, so I was obligated to talk with the counselor and say, "Hey, you might want to call so and so into the office. They were talking about getting wasted this weekend, right?" So there are circumstances where you don't have freedom of speech. So this was actually a seditious speech, but it was about the draft. This is an older case. We'll stop after this one.
Just how far does an individual's right to free speech extend? The 1919 court case of Schenck versus the United States was central in defining some of the limitations of free speech rights. You see, during World War I, the U.S. instituted a military draft in which 24 million men registered and 2.5 million were actually drafted into the military. This generated outrage from certain anti-war groups, such as socialists, anarchists, and peace advocates. Now, President Woodrow Wilson was not a fan of the demonstrations or anti-war literature that some of these groups were generating. Wilson said, "Such creatures of passion, disloyalty, and anarchy must be crushed out." One such protester was Charles Schenck. He was a member of the Socialist Party and was responsible for distributing a leaflet urging recently drafted men to resist the draft. This pamphlet asserted that the draft violated the 13th Amendment, which prohibited involuntary servitude or slavery. He also condemned the federal government and the war. The federal government then arrested Schenck and charged him with violating the Espionage Act of 1917, which made it a crime to obstruct the recruiting or enlistment service. Schenck maintained that the First Amendment's free speech clause protected his right to criticize the government. The Supreme Court took up the question. Unfortunately for Charles Schenck, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously against him. They argued that wartime circumstances changed the rules related to the right of free speech. The court, in an opinion written by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., said, "We admit that in many places and in ordinary times, the defendants, in saying all that was said in the circular, would have been within their constitutional rights. But the character of every act depends on the circumstances in which it is done." The court also created the clear and present danger rule, a new test for free speech. The court decided the question in every case is whether the words used are used in such circumstances and are of such a nature as to create a clear and present danger that they will bring about the substantive evils that Congress has a right to prevent. When a nation is at war, many things that might be said in time of peace are such a hindrance to its effort that their utterance will not be endured so long as men fight, and that no court could regard them as protected by any constitutional right. From saying bomb on an airplane to yelling fire in a crowded theater, Schenck versus the United States is still applicable today. Clear and present danger would guide free speech conversations until the 1969 case of Brandenburg versus Ohio clarified it further, bringing us imminent lawless action. This would define suppressed speech as speech that incites the imminent and likely violation of a law. But that's a story for another time. For more information on this and many other important court cases throughout history, be sure to check out the other videos in our Homework Help series.
So there you go. All right, that is that for today. We'll get into other ones later on.